The study smelled of candle wax and something older. Something that had been burning quietly for a long time without anyone noticing. It was past midnight when Chelsea Mason heard her husband's footsteps stop outside the door, and she knew before she entered that whatever waited on the other side of it had been waiting for a very long time. The fire had burned to embers. The room was amber and shadow. Ryan stood at a writing desk with his back to the door, still dressed from dinner, his dark coat unbuttoned at the chest, his cravat loose at his throat. He was not moving. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the letter in his hand, not the open desk drawer with its false bottom exposed. The stillness. Ryan Mason in stillness was not a man at rest. He was a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the moment to arrive. Chelsea stepped inside. The cold stone floor pressed through her thin slippers. She waited. Outside, somewhere deep in the Aldermere grounds, an owl called once and received no answer. He stood with his back to her when she entered the room. He did not turn. He asked her if she thought he would never find it. She asked him, find what? He turned. His face was unreadable. That was what made him terrifying. Not his anger, not his coldness, not the quiet way he could ruin an evening with a single glance across a dinner table. It was this, the complete absence of expression. His gray eyes held hers without blinking, without warmth, without anything at all that she could name or prepare for. He told her about the receipt for the carriage driver, dated the night before his wedding. The silence that followed had weight. Chelsea did not move. She had not moved in 12 months. She was not going to start now. He told her she had paid him to take Rosalind away. Not her family, not a lover, her. He said it the way a judge reads a verdict. Quietly, finally, without pleasure. She said yes. He had expected denial. He had prepared for denial, had rehearsed his response to tears, to excuses, to the particular aristocratic deflection that women of her class were trained from birth to deploy. He had not prepared for yes. He told her to say it again. She told him she had paid the driver to take Rosalind to Scotland and never return, and she hadn't. So if he was going to kill her, she asked that he please do it before breakfast. She found executions terribly rude on an empty stomach. Ryan laughed. It came from somewhere low in his chest, and it had no warmth in it whatsoever. He told her death would be mercy, and that he had no mercy left. He picked up the letter from the desk, folded it once, slowly, deliberately, and set it back down like it was a verdict he had already signed. The candlelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the controlled tension in his shoulders. He was a man who had learned to weaponize composure, and he was using every bit of it now. Then he stepped closer. She did not step back. The ember light moved across her face, and for just 1 second, something passed through her eyes that was not fear and was not defiance. It was older than both. It was the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for exactly 1 year, who had always known it was coming, who had made her peace with it long before he ever found the receipt. He told her he had married her to make her suffer for what her sister did. But she was the reason Rosalind left, so now he would make her suffer for both. The words filled the room the way smoke fills a room, slowly, completely, finding every corner. Chelsea looked at him and thought about arithmetic, about the calculation she had made 2 years ago in a Wiltshire garden on a wet evening that smelled of grass and coming rain. She had been so certain the numbers were right. She was less certain now. But she did not say this. She said nothing. That silence, more than anything else that had happened in that room, was what kept Ryan Mason awake until dawn. He had wanted tears. He had wanted collapse. He had wanted the satisfaction of watching the woman who had engineered his humiliation finally understand the cost of what she had done. What he had gotten instead was Chelsea standing in the amber dark of her own study, in her gray dressing gown, with her bare feet on the cold stone floor, looking at him with eyes that had already absorbed the blow and were still standing. He left the room without another word, because there was nothing else to say, and because staying would have required him to name what he was feeling, and he was not ready to do that. His footsteps echoed down the corridor. Chelsea stood in the study alone. The embers clicked, the candle guttered. She pressed one hand flat against the desk and breathed. Just breathed. Outside, the owl called again. This time, faintly. Something answered. 3 years before the midnight study, Chelsea Voss was standing in the wet grass of the Voss estate's back garden at 9 in the evening, holding a lantern and listening to her sister cry. The Wiltshire fields stretched dark behind the hedgerows. The house glowed yellow behind them. Inside, Lady Maren was writing congratulatory replies to the letters that had arrived since the engagement announcement. The announcement that had appeared in the Morning Post, Rosalind Voss to wed Ryan Mason, Duke of Aldermere, had produced 17 letters by afternoon. Lady Maren had wept over each one, with the relief of a woman who had been holding her breath for 7 years. Chelsea had read the announcement once, and then gone to find Rosalind, because Rosalind had not come down for tea, and Chelsea had learned long ago to notice the things that other people were too busy celebrating to see. She found her sister in the garden in the dark, sitting on the stone wall with her knees pulled up, crying in the specific, silent way of someone who has been practicing not being heard. Rosalind Voss was 24, and she was the kind of beautiful that made rooms rearrange themselves, golden-haired, soft-voiced, with the kind of laugh that arrived like an apology. She had been trained since childhood in every accomplishment that mattered. French, watercolor, the precise art of entering a room at exactly the right speed. She was not cruel. That was important. She was simply a woman who had been told her entire life that she was the answer to her family's problems and had believed it with the sincere and suffocating weight of someone who genuinely wanted to help. She had met the Duke of Aldermere 3 times. He was correct and cold and looked at her the way men looked at a painting they intended to purchase, with assessment rather than feeling. She had smiled through all 3 meetings with the practiced warmth of a woman performing her function. What she had not told anyone, not Lady Maren, not the solicitors, not the Duke's man of business who came to finalize the settlements, was that she had been in love with Daniel Holt for 3 years, a merchant's son from Salisbury, a man who looked at her like she was a person rather than a solution. Chelsea was 21, and she was the kind of person rooms forgot, not because she was unpleasant, because she had learned early that the easiest way to survive in a house where one person absorbed all the light was to become comfortable in the shadow. Dark-haired where Rosalind was golden, quiet where Rosalind was musical. She read books considered inappropriate for young women and kept them hidden behind appropriate ones on the shelf. She managed the household accounts when Lady Maren's headaches grew too severe. She knew which tenant's roof needed repair and which wages were 3 weeks overdue. She did the invisible work that kept the estate breathing, and nobody thanked her because nobody noticed it enough to think thanks was required. She had met Ryan Mason once, 6 months prior, at a county assembly in Marlborough. He had not spoken to her, but she had watched him across the room for the better part of an hour. She had watched him stand alone at the edge of the dancing with a glass of wine he barely touched, and she had thought he was the loneliest person she had ever seen. She had not expected to think about him again. In the garden that night, Rosalind told her everything. Daniel Holt. 3 years of letters and stolen hours, and a love she could not stop and would not stop. She said she would rather disappear from England entirely than stand at an altar and vow herself to a man she felt nothing for while Daniel existed somewhere in the world. She said it with the desperate conviction of someone who had made up their mind weeks ago and was only now finding the words. Chelsea held the lantern and listened and felt the wet grass cold through her thin shoes, and thought about the Duke standing alone at the assembly room wall with his untouched wine and his tired eyes. She thought about what it would do to a man already lonely to spend his life married to a woman who loved someone else. Then she asked Rosalind one question. She asked if she was certain. Rosalind said she had never been more certain of anything. Chelsea nodded once. She said she would need 3 days to think. Rosalind asked what there was to think about. Chelsea said everything. She spent those 3 days with the account books, not the household ones, the estate ones, the ones that showed £4,000 advanced against the marriage settlement by the Aldermere estate, the ones that showed the Voss roof, the Voss creditors, the Voss future, balanced entirely on the weight of one golden-haired daughter's wedding. She sat with those numbers for 3 days, and she understood that the arithmetic was not simply about 2 people destroyed versus one family's plans disrupted. It was about what happened to Lady Marin when the settlement was recalled, what happened to the tenants when the estate collapsed, what happened to the quiet, overlooked second daughter who had been managing the books long enough to know that there was no other way out of them. On the 3rd evening, she went to find Rosalind and told her there would be a carriage at the eastern gate at 2 a.m. on the eve of the wedding. She told her it would take her to Scotland and not stop. She told her Daniel Holt had been contacted and would meet her in Edinburgh, and she told her that if she stepped into that carriage she could not change her mind, not halfway to the border, not ever. Rosalind looked at her for a long time. Then she took Chelsea's hands and held them and said she was sorry. Chelsea said she knew. She did not say what she was sorry for. She did not need to. The carriage driver's name was Pell. He was a broad man of 50 with a face like weathered leather and a reputation for discretion that had been purchased rather than earned. Chelsea found him through the estate's headgroom, a roundabout arrangement constructed carefully so that no thread led directly back to her. She met him on a Wednesday afternoon in the yard of a coaching inn 4 miles from the Voss estate, arriving on horseback, alone, wearing a plain brown cloak with the hood pulled low against the October drizzle. The inn yard smelled of horse and wet straw and the particular sourness of a place where people came to leave without being remembered. Pell was leaning against the stable wall with a pipe. He looked at her, the way men looked at women who arrived alone at coaching inns, with the quick, calculating assessment of someone trying to understand what they were dealing with. Chelsea looked back at him steadily until he put the pipe down. She had learned early that the most effective response to being assessed was to make it clear you were assessing back. She told him what she needed. A carriage at the eastern gate of the Voss estate at 2 a.m. on the 23rd. 1 passenger to Edinburgh without stopping except for horses. No turning back regardless of what the passenger said. And complete silence about the arrangement afterward. Pell listened with his arms folded and his eyes half closed in the expression of a man calculating price. When she finished, he told her it would cost £15. Chelsea had counted the money before she left the house. It was nearly everything she had saved over 4 years of quiet economies, coins unspent from market errands, a silver bracelet sold to a jeweler in Salisbury the previous autumn. She placed it on the stable wall between them without speaking. Pell looked at it. Then he told her there was something else. He told her about a fire at a coaching inn in Devizes 3 years prior. He said certain questions about that fire had never been properly answered. He said he assumed a woman who had found him through the channels she had used understood that discretion worked in multiple directions. Chelsea looked at him for a moment. Then she said she assumed a man who was accepting £15 understood that she kept records. He took the money. She rode home through the gray afternoon and did not allow herself to feel anything. She told Rosalind that night in Rosalind's bedroom, with the door locked and the candle turned low. Not everything. She did not tell Rosalind about Pell, or the £15, or the calculating eyes in the coaching inn yard. She told her only what she needed to know. The carriage, the time, Edinburgh, Daniel. And then she told her something she had not planned to say. She told Rosalind that once she stepped into that carriage, there was no version of events in which Chelsea's life continued as it had been. That the settlement would be recalled. That Lady Merrin would know. That the only way to contain the damage was for someone to offer Ryan Mason something in place of what he had lost. Rosalind went pale. She asked Chelsea what she was saying. Chelsea said she was saying that the arithmetic required someone to pay the remainder of the sum and that she had already decided it would be her. Rosalind said that was not a plan. Chelsea said it was the only one available. What she did not say, what she buried so deep she almost stopped knowing it was there, was the image of Ryan Mason standing alone at the assembly room wall 3 years ago, looking tired and far away. She had told herself that image meant nothing. She was not convincing. The morning of the 23rd arrived cold and white. Chelsea was dressed by 5. She sat at her window and watched the eastern gate, and at 2:14 she heard it. Wheels on gravel. The gate. Then nothing. The sound of it was not dramatic. It was simply the sound of something irrevocable, becoming past tense. She sat at the window for a long time after the sound was gone, looking at the darkness where it had been, and she felt the full weight of what she had set in motion settle into her chest. Not regret exactly. Something more complicated. The understanding that right and necessary were not always the same thing, and that she had just done something that was possibly both and would cost her either way. She went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until the sky turned gray. Then she got up and dressed and went downstairs and helped her mother finalize the seating arrangements for a wedding that would never happen. She was, above all things, precise. Ryan Mason arrived at 9:45. Chelsea watched him from the upstairs window. He came in the Aldermere carriage, black and immaculate, the family crest on the door. He stepped out into the October morning in his wedding clothes, dark coat, white cravat, hair pressed into the kind of correctness that takes a valet considerable effort, and he walked up the front steps with the measured stride of a man who had accepted that this day was a transaction and intended to complete it with dignity. He was shown to the drawing room, Lady Merrin told him. His face did not collapse. It closed, like a shutter pulled across a window. He sat still for a moment. Then he asked one question. He asked whether there was anything else Lady Merrin wished to tell him. Lady Merrin said no. He thanked her. He left. Chelsea watched him walk back down the steps and stop at the carriage door and stand there for a moment with his hand on the frame, looking out at the October fields going gold in the morning light. She felt the iron settle into her chest. He got into the carriage. The door closed. The horses moved. She stood at the window long after the sound was gone and the gates had closed and there was nothing left to watch. Behind her, the white roses from the Aldermere greenhouses filled the hallway with their scent. She would never be able to smell white roses again without feeling that moment in her bones. The letter from Ryan Mason's solicitor arrived 6 weeks later. It was addressed to Lady Merrin and written in the precise, bloodless language of men who deal in arrangements rather than feelings. It explained that under the terms of the late Duke of Aldermere's will, Ryan Mason was required to marry before his 32nd birthday, which fell in April of the following year, or forfeit control of the Eastern Aldermere estates to a cousin trustee named in the will, a man named Lord Gerald Fenn, who had been waiting for exactly this circumstance with the patient hunger of someone who has never stopped believing that someone else's misfortune is their inheritance. The letter further noted that the £4,000 advanced against the original marriage settlement remained outstanding, and that the Duke was prepared to consider the debt resolved in exchange for an alternative arrangement, specifically the availability of Miss Chelsea Voss as a substitution for her sister, subject to Lady Merrin's agreement and Miss Chelsea Voss's consent. The word consent appeared once. Chelsea read it standing at the kitchen table and understood that Ryan Mason had included it not because he believed she had a genuine choice, but because he was a precise man who knew that legal documents required the appearance of 1. Lady Marin came back 20 minutes after leaving Chelsea alone with the letter. She sat down across the kitchen table, which she never did, which meant she was about to say something that required a room without witnesses. She told Chelsea she did not have to do this, that the debt could be managed, that they would find another way. Chelsea looked at her mother across the worn kitchen wood and thought about the account books she managed every month, the creditors whose letters she intercepted before they reached the Morning Post, the east wing roof patched 3 times with diminishing creativity. She told her mother they would not find another way. Lady Marin looked at her for a long time with the expression of a woman who understood everything her daughter was not saying. Then she asked one question. She asked Chelsea if she was certain. Chelsea said yes. Lady Marin nodded once. She did not ask how Chelsea knew about the carriage. Some questions, Chelsea had always believed. Her mother had decided not to ask because the answers would require her to feel something she had no room to feel. The wedding took place on a Tuesday in November at a small church outside Salisbury. A gray morning with low cloud and the smell of coming rain. The vicar was a quiet man who asked no questions. The witness was Ryan's solicitor, Mr. Harcastle, who stood to the side with his hands folded and his face professionally neutral. Chelsea wore a dress of deep green wool that she had altered herself because there was no time and no money for anything else. Her hair was pinned simply. She carried no flowers. She had not wanted white roses, and she had not been able to think of anything else without feeling the iron in her chest, so she had carried nothing. Ryan stood beside her at the altar and spoke his vows in a voice that was perfectly correct and completely empty. He did not look at her once during the ceremony except at the exact moments courtesy required. Chelsea spoke her vows clearly and without trembling. She had decided the night before that trembling was not available to her as an option. The vicar pronounced them married. Ryan placed a ring on her finger, a thin gold band, cold and unadorned, without touching her hand. The carriage to Aldermere Hall smelled of leather and cold air. 3 hours. Neither of them spoke. Chelsea watched the Wiltshire countryside pass in the gray November light, the bare fields and dark hedgerows, and the occasional farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney into the flat sky. She thought about the coaching inn in Devizes, and Pell, and the £15, and the sound of carriage wheels on gravel at 2:14 in the morning. She thought about arithmetic. She thought about Ryan Mason standing at the assembly room wall 3 years ago, and she buried that thought in the deepest room she had and locked it and told herself the key was lost. Across the carriage, Ryan sat with his eyes fixed on the window and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who had made a decision he intended to see through regardless of the cost. He had not looked at her directly since the church. She understood this was not indifference. Indifferent men do not arrange their weddings with this much cold precision. He looked like a man who had been made a fool of once and had decided never to be made a fool of again, and she was the available target for that decision, and they both understood it. The carriage rolled on through the gray afternoon. Outside the window, England went dark and quiet and eventual, and Aldermere Hall appeared on the horizon, large and gray and lit from within, like something that had been waiting. Ryan came to her door that first night and told her how things would be. The west wing was hers, the east was his. Public appearances when required, domestic management in consultation with Mrs. Gale. No interference from him in her running of the household. No interest from him in her opinions or her inner life. He would visit her rooms when the matter of succession required it, not otherwise. He delivered this standing in the doorway of her room with the door open behind him, a detail she noticed because it meant he had not intended to enter, had intended to deliver his terms from the threshold and leave. He was wearing his evening clothes still, coat on, cravat straight, as though maintaining his full armor for a conversation with his own wife. Chelsea listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said she understood. He nodded. He left. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor and disappear into the east wing, and she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the gray walls of her gray room and thought, this is the arithmetic. This is what it looks like from the inside. She had been right about the cost. She had simply not understood yet that she would be the one paying it with her actual life rather than an abstraction of it. The cruelty was never loud. That was the thing about Ryan Mason that Chelsea had not understood until she was living inside it. She had expected anger. She had prepared for anger because anger was at least warm. What she got instead was architecture, a precisely designed structure of absence and exposure and cold, targeted humiliation built with the care of a man who understood exactly which kind of damage left no visible mark. The first month, he simply did not come to dinner. Not once. No explanation was offered through Mrs. Gale or anyone else. His place was set each evening by the staff because nobody had told them otherwise. Chelsea sat at the long dining table alone each night, with the candles burning and the food cooling, and ate her meal with her back straight and her face composed, because the staff was watching and she had decided on the first morning that she would not give this house any expression it could carry back to the East Wing. She asked Mrs. Gale on the fourth evening to reset only one place at the table going forward. Mrs. Gale did it without comment. Her eyes, however, said something careful and complicated that Chelsea filed away and did not examine yet. She began eating in the estate office instead, with the account books open, because she had found the books in a state that required immediate attention, and eating while working was more efficient than eating alone at a table built for 30. Within 2 weeks, she had identified 4 separate inefficiencies in the household expenditure. Within 3, she had fixed them. The kitchen budget dropped by 20%. The staff noticed. They began, cautiously, to look at her differently. The second month, Ryan brought Miriam Ashwick to the Lathwell dinner. Miriam was the widow of Sir Charles Ashwick, clever and beautiful in the cool, deliberate way of women who have learned to use beauty as a professional tool. She wore amber silk that evening and laughed at the right moments and placed her gloved hand briefly on Ryan's arm twice during the soup course in the easy, familiar way of a woman who had done it many times before. Ryan seated her on his left. Chelsea sat on his right and spoke pleasantly to Lord Lathwell about his prize roses for 40 minutes and did not look at Miriam Ashwick more than once, because once was enough to understand everything. The drive home was silent. Chelsea looked out the window at the dark Wiltshire countryside and felt something shift inside her that was not grief. It was recognition. She had grown up invisible, and she knew what deliberate invisibility felt like from the inside. The difference was that this version had an audience. Ryan was not indifferent. Indifferent men do not engineer their cruelty this carefully. He wanted her to feel it. She decided, quietly and permanently, not to let him see that she did. The third month, he moved her from the West Wing rooms to a smaller set in the North Corridor, colder, windows facing a wall, a fireplace that drew badly and filled the room with smoke on windy nights. Mrs. Gale delivered the instruction with her eyes fractionally too careful, which meant she disapproved and was not going to say so to either party. Chelsea moved without comment. On the second morning, she had the chimney assessed by a local mason named Perch and arranged for it to be partially rebuilt at her own expense, 12 shillings from the household allowance she had quietly negotiated with Mr. Harcastle's office before leaving Wiltshire. Ryan found out from the estate accounts 3 weeks later. He said nothing. But the following month's budget included an unexplained line item that covered the cost exactly. Chelsea sat with this detail for a long time. She did not know what to do with it. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that did not yet have a category. By the 6th month, the pattern was established. She managed the hall. He managed his distance. She reorganized the linen inventory, restructured the kitchen accounts, wrote to the head groundskeeper about the south field drainage problem that had apparently been discussed and deferred for 4 years, and began a correspondence with neighboring estates about timber pricing that would eventually save Aldermere several £100 annually. The tenants had started to trust her. She had ridden out herself to the Morrison farm in September and found the kitchen wall crumbling and the barn roof one hard winter away from collapse, and she had arranged repairs through Mrs. Gale that same week because deferred maintenance was a luxury that people who lived in those buildings could not afford, regardless of what the estate calendar said. She did all of this in the North Corridor rooms at night by candlelight after the household had retired because the days belonged to the work and the nights were all she had for thinking. She was, in every visible way, managing. What nobody saw, what she showed nobody, was the weight of it. The specific exhaustion of performing competence while carrying a secret in a house that had been designed to punish her. The night she broke was a Tuesday in October, 11 months into the marriage. She had come upstairs after the staff had retired and sat at her writing table to finish a letter to the Aldermere solicitor about the timber contracts and found she could not hold the pen. Not because her hand was tired, because something in her chest had simply given way without warning. The way a beam gives way, not dramatically, just finally, after holding too long. She sat at the table in the dark North Corridor room with the pen in her hand and the letter half finished, and she cried. Not the quiet, controlled kind, the other kind. The kind that has no dignity in it. The kind that sounds like grief, and is grief. For the £15 in the coaching-in yard, and the sound of wheels on gravel and the white roses and the assembly room and the arithmetic that had seemed so clean from the outside and was so costly from the inside. She cried for 20 minutes. Then she washed her face. Then she finished the letter. Then she went to bed. She told no one. She allowed herself that one night, and no others. It was the most honest thing she had done in 11 months. We are halfway through this story, and I need to know something. In the comments right now, tell me, do you think Chelsea was wrong to do what she did? Or do you think she was the only one brave enough to do what nobody else would? Drop your answer below. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the moment, because what happens next changes everything. Ryan Mason had not intended to watch her. The plan had been to ignore her. It was a clean plan. It required no emotional investment and produced, he had calculated, the maximum effect. A woman who had grown up overlooked would find being overlooked again in her own marriage unbearable. He had been certain of this. He had been wrong in the specific and humiliating way that precise men are wrong when they have made an assumption about a person they have not actually bothered to understand. He first noticed the problem in the 5th month. He had come down to the estate office at an unusual hour because his horse had thrown a shoe and he had turned back early from his morning ride. He passed the estate office door and heard Chelsea's voice inside, speaking to his steward, Mr. Aldous, a man of 30 years' experience, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided long ago that his methods were correct and saw no reason to revisit them. She was explaining to him with precise and completely unapologetic clarity why the Southern timber contracts were undervalued by approximately 18% relative to current market prices. She had obtained comparable contracts from 3 neighboring estates through correspondence. She had prepared a renegotiation approach. Mr. Aldous was listening. Not performing listening, actually listening, with the slightly arrested expression of a man encountering an argument he cannot immediately counter. Ryan stood outside the door for 4 minutes. He had assigned her the North Corridor rooms and revoked her access to nothing that mattered, and she had apparently spent 5 months reorganizing his finances. He went to his study. He sat at his desk. He thought about this for a long time. The second problem was the Morrison farm. He rode out in the 7th month to inspect it, a quarterly obligation he fulfilled on time because he was a precise man, and found the kitchen wall freshly plastered and the barn roof newly patched. He asked Morrison when this had been done. Morrison said 2 months past. Said the Duchess had come by herself, walked the whole farm, noted what needed doing, and had it arranged through Mrs. Gale, within a week. His wife had cried, Morrison said, with a slightly embarrassed candor of a man reporting something he found moving and wished he didn't. Said no one from the house had ever come before. Just sent instructions. Ryan sat on his horse in the Morrison farmyard and looked at the new plaster and the new roof and felt something he identified correctly and refused to examine. He rode home and pulled out the household accounts and read them carefully for the first time in 4 months. What he found was a record of such thorough and intelligent management that he closed the ledger and sat in his study in the dark for a long time doing nothing at all. He had given her the north corridor rooms and a cold fireplace and public humiliation at the Lathwell dinner. She had given his estate its first competent year of management in a decade. He did not know what to do with this information. The third problem happened in the 8th month, and he had not been able to stop thinking about it since. He was coming down the main staircase late on a Tuesday evening when he heard music from the small parlor. Not performed music. Something else entirely. She was playing something without a clear melody, something that moved in long, slow phrases like a conversation between people who knew each other well enough to leave the obvious things unsaid. She was playing it imperfectly, missing notes, pausing in the wrong places, starting sections over. But she was playing it with such complete privacy, such total unawareness of any audience, that Ryan felt like a man who had walked into a room and found something he was not supposed to see. He stood on the staircase for a long time. When he finally moved, it was back upstairs, not down. He lay on his bed in the dark east wing and stared at the ceiling and thought about what it meant that his wife played imperfect music alone at 10 in the evening and played it with more feeling than anything he had heard in a London concert hall. He told himself it meant nothing. He was not convincing, and he knew he was not convincing, which made it worse. By the 10th month, he had stopped seeing Miriam Ashwick. He did not announce this. He simply stopped sending notes. Miriam was not a woman who accepted dismissal quietly. She appeared at the Aldermere gates on a Thursday morning in a carriage and sent in her card. Ryan met her in the front drawing room. She sat across from him in the pale morning light and looked at him with the clear eyes of a woman who knew exactly what was happening and had decided to make him say it aloud. She asked him if there was someone else. He said there was no one else. She said that was technically true and practically false, and they both knew it. She told him she was not angry. She told him, with the collected dignity of a woman who had survived worse, that she hoped whatever was keeping him at home was worth the considerable effort it had taken to get him there. Then she stood and left without waiting for a response. Her carriage wheels on the gravel drive were the last sound of her. Ryan stood at the drawing-room window and watched her go and felt the particular discomfort of a man who has been seen accurately by someone he had not given that permission to. He went to find Chelsea. She was in the estate office. He stood in the doorway and watched her write for a moment. She did not look up. He left without speaking. But that evening he came to dinner for the first time in 4 months. Chelsea looked up when he sat down. She said nothing. He said nothing. They ate in silence. But the silence was different from what it had been. December arrived at Aldermere, with hard frost and short days and a quality of light in the mornings that turned the ground silver and made everything look like it had been pressed under glass. Chelsea moved through these mornings with the particular alertness of someone whose circumstances have shifted without the shift being named yet. Ryan had come to dinner 7 evenings in the past 2 weeks. He had not spoken to her at dinner beyond the minimum that courtesy required, but he was there. And being there was different from not being there in a way she could feel but could not yet trust. She was in the estate office on a Thursday morning reviewing the winter maintenance schedule when she heard him come in. Not a knock, just his footstep in the doorway. The particular weight of it she had learned to recognize over 12 months of living in the same building as a man who moved as though the floor was his. She finished the sentence she was writing because she refused to let his presence make her lose her place. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without being invited. She waited. Outside, the frost-stiff grounds were pale and empty under a flat gray sky. He told her he wanted to know why. She asked him why what. He said she knew what. She set down her pen. She told him she would answer one question if he answered one of hers first. He said that was not how this worked. She said she was aware of how things worked in this house and was proposing an alternative. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, fine. She asked him whether he had been happy with Rosalind. The question landed between them like something thrown from a great height. He said it was irrelevant. She said she knew it was irrelevant and was asking anyway. He was quiet for long enough that she picked up her pen again. And then he said no. He said he had met Rosalind Voss 3 times before the engagement was arranged, and on each occasion she had been perfectly pleasant and perfectly correct and had said nothing he could remember 5 minutes after leaving the room. He had thought that was fine. He had thought that was the nature of these arrangements. He said it with the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man describing a mistake he had made when he was younger and less informed. Then he said it was her turn. Chelsea looked at him across the desk and felt the cold iron of the past year sitting heavy in her chest, and thought about the Wiltshire garden and the 15 pounds and the image she had locked away and lost the key to. Then she told him everything. Not the clean version, the real one. She told him about Rosalind crying in the garden and Daniel Holt and the 3 days with the account books. She told him about Pell and the coaching inn-yard and the cold eyes of a man calculating price. She told him about the silver bracelet and the 15 pounds and riding home through the gray afternoon, telling herself not to feel anything. She told him about standing at the window watching him in his wedding clothes and the iron settling in her chest. She told him about the kitchen table and Lady Marin's eyes and the green wool dress she had altered herself. She told him she had not planned to marry him. She told him she had simply failed to plan against it, and that there was a difference, and that she had spent 12 months telling herself the difference was meaningful. Then she stopped. She sat with her hands flat on the desk and looked at the man across from her and waited. Outside, the frost-stiff grounds held their cold silence. The estate office clock ticked. The fire settled. She watched him receive everything she had just said, and she did not look away. Ryan Mason sat very still for a long time after she finished. The kind of stillness that was not calm but processing. The way a man goes still when he is revising a version of events he had held as certain. He stood up from the chair. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she watched him and thought about every time she had seen him stand exactly like that, back turned, shoulders controlled, something being held in. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned around. His face was not unreadable. It was the opposite of unreadable. It was a face that had run out of architecture and was standing open for the first time in years, exposed and angular and deeply, painfully real. He said her name. Just Chelsea. She said yes. He said he did not know what to do with any of this. She said she didn't either. He said that was the first honest thing they had said to each other. She said it was probably the first honest thing they had said to each other ever. He almost smiled. It was not a pleasant smile, but it was real. In 12 months, it was the first real thing she had seen on his face, and it sat in her chest in a place that was not iron. After the estate office, After the honest words and the real smile, and the first breach in the architecture of their arranged cruelty, Ryan Mason went back to the East Wing and sat at his desk and did something he had not done in 3 years. He tried to think clearly about his own feelings and found that he could not. This was new. He was a man who had prided himself on clarity of thought and precision of decision since the age of 20, when his father had died and left him a dukedom and a will with a marriage clause and a cousin named Gerald Fenn watching from the wings. He had been precise ever since. He had been precise about the marriage arrangements, and precise about the cruelty, and precise about Miriam Ashwick, and precise about the dinner absences and the North Corridor rooms and all the careful architecture of a revenge he had. Built with the focused energy of a man who needed to be doing something with his pain. Now he sat at his desk and tried to be precise about Chelsea Voss, and found that precision had no language for what he was working with. He came to dinner the following evening, and the one after. On the third evening, he brought the estate account ledgers from the past 8 months to the dining table after the meal and placed them in front of her without speaking. She looked at him. He said he had reviewed them. He said the timber renegotiation alone had saved the estate £340. He said the Morrison Farm repairs had prevented a legal dispute with the tenant that would have cost considerably more. He said the kitchen budget reduction had been sustained for 6 months without any decline in the quality of what came out of it. He said all of this with the tone of a man reading figures from a ledger, which was what he was doing, but she understood that he was not talking about the figures. She said she was glad the numbers were useful. He said they were more than useful. She said she knew. He looked at her across the dinner table with the candlelight between them and said nothing for a moment. Then he said he had been wrong about several things. She said she knew that too. He said knowing was different from saying. She said yes, it was. 3 days after that conversation, he did something that made her stop in the corridor and stand very still for a full minute. He had left a book on the hall table outside the estate office door. A volume on agricultural management, recently published, with a paper marker in the chapter on drainage systems. She picked it up and opened it and found his handwriting in the margins. Not annotations. Notes to her, written directly in the margins beside the relevant passages, connecting the text to specific problems on the Aldermere estate in his precise, cramped hand. She stood in the corridor with the book open and read 3 pages of margin notes and felt something move in her chest that was warm and specific and frightening. She closed the book. She carried it to her office. She read the rest of the notes before noon. That evening at dinner, she mentioned the Southfield drainage proposal in the book, and he answered, and they talked about drainage for 40 minutes, with the focused energy of 2 people who had finally found a language they both spoke. Natively. It was the longest conversation they had ever had. When she went to bed that night, she lay in the dark North Corridor room and thought about the margin notes and felt the warm, specific, frightening thing again and told herself it was simply the natural response to being treated like a person after a year of being treated like a problem. She was not entirely convincing. The friction came on a Friday evening. He had been to London for 3 days on parliamentary business, the first time he had left Aldermere since November, and he returned on a Friday afternoon in a mood that she recognized by the particular quality of his silence at dinner, the kind that was not empty but compressed, something in it looking for a direction. She did not ask. She had learned that asking gave the compressed silence a target. After dinner, he followed her to the small parlor where she had been spending her evenings with her reading and stood in the doorway and said that he had seen Gerald Fenn in London. She looked up from her book. He said Fenn had made a comment about the marriage, about the speed of it in the circumstances and the question of whether the substitution of one sister for another constituted a valid fulfillment of the will's conditions. His voice was controlled. His hands were not. They were at his sides and very slightly not still. She understood that he was telling her this because he did not have anyone else to tell it to. She set down her book. She told him that Mr. Hardcastle had anticipated exactly this challenge and had filed documentation with the Court of Chancery in November, specifically addressing the question of substitution under the will's terms. She told him she had asked Mr. Hardcastle to do this in October because she had read the will in September and identified the vulnerability herself. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. He asked when she had read the will. She said the second week of their marriage. He said she had been protecting the estate from a legal challenge for 3 months without telling him. She said she had been protecting both of them. He stood in the parlor doorway for a long time. Then he came in. He sat down across from her. He asked her why she hadn't told him. She said because she had not yet known whether he was someone she could trust with the information or someone who would use it as further evidence of her manipulation. He said that was a fair assessment. She said she knew. He said he was sorry. For the North Corridor rooms, for Miriam Ashwick, for the dinner absences and the assembly and all the careful architecture of it. He said it plainly, without performance, in the flat, honest tone of a man who has decided that the only way through is through. She looked at him across the small parlor with the firelight between them and felt the iron in her chest begin, slowly and painfully and without fanfare, to shift. January came in white and final. Snow arrived overnight and transformed the Aldermere grounds into something that looked wiped clean, as though the year had been removed and replaced with a surface that had not yet been written on. Chelsea stood at the North Corridor window in the early morning and looked at it and thought that this was what a pause looked like from the outside, a held breath. She was not sure what it looked like from the inside. She was still finding out. The letter from Edinburgh arrived on the 14th. Rosalind's handwriting on the envelope. Chelsea carried it to her room before opening it. 2 pages in Rosalind's hand and 1 in a wider, more formal script she recognized after a moment as Daniel Holt's. Rosalind's pages said she was well. That Daniel was well? That the textile business had grown considerably since the autumn. And then, in the careful handwriting of a woman who had been choosing her words for months, Rosalind wrote that she had heard, through a mutual acquaintance who had attended the Lathwell dinner, something of the nature of Chelsea's life at Aldermere. She wrote that she was sorry. She wrote it 3 times on the same page, each time differently, as though trying to find the version large enough to carry what she meant. She wrote that she wanted to come back to England, that she would speak to Ryan herself, that she would tell him the truth of what had happened and take the blame that was properly hers, that she would do whatever Chelsea needed. Chelsea read this and felt the iron move again, not gone, just shifting, like something long fixed, beginning to find a different position. Then she read Daniel Holt's page. Daniel wrote that Rosalind was 4 months pregnant and that a journey from Edinburgh in January was not something he would permit under any circumstances, which he said with the direct protectiveness of a man who had decided what mattered and intended to defend it. He wrote that Rosalind's desire to return was genuine and that her inability to act on it immediately was entirely his fault for the small and significant fact of the child expected in June. He wrote that he hoped Chelsea would understand and that he was sorry, not for marrying Rosalind. He would not be sorry for that, but for the cost of it, which he understood had been paid by someone else entirely. Chelsea sat with all 3 pages in her lap and looked out the window at the white grounds for a long time. She thought about what Rosalind returning would mean. She thought about Ryan in the small parlor saying, "I am sorry," in the flat, honest tone of a man who had decided to mean it. She thought about the margin notes, the morning light through the east-facing windows of the central corridor rooms he had moved her to last month, quietly, without explanation, better light on both sides. She thought about what she was building here and what Rosalind's return would do to it. She wrote back that afternoon. She told Rosalind not to come. She told her the journey was too long and the pregnancy too important and January too cold. She told her that the situation at Aldermere was being managed. She told her that Ryan knew the truth now, and that they were finding their way through it slowly, and that slowly was not the same as badly. She sealed the letter and gave it to the footman, and then went to find Ryan. He was in the estate office, looking at the spring planting schedule. She sat down across from him and told him about the letter. All of it. Rosalind's offer, Daniel's note, the pregnancy, her reply. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The office was cold. Snowlight came through the window and made everything look clear and temporary. He asked why she had told Rosalind not to come. Chelsea looked at him steadily across the desk where 14 months ago he had stood over her and promised to make her suffer for both. She said because Rosalind returning would not fix what was broken here, that this was not something that could be fixed from outside. He asked what would fix it. She said she thought it was the kind of thing that did not get fixed so much as built, slowly, from whatever remained after everything else had been removed. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said he had been building things slowly his entire life and had never built anything he was proud of. She said neither had she. He said that was a place to start. She said yes, it was. That night, Ryan came to the north corridor. He knocked. She said he could come in. He stood in the doorway in the winter dark and looked at the room he had assigned her as punishment, the cold walls and the bad window and the fireplace that drew properly now and filled the space with real warmth, and he looked at what she had made of it. The small bookshelf, the watercolor of the east field pinned above the writing table, the letter case organized in her particular way, the margin-noted book from the hall table sitting open on the desk beside her current correspondence. He stood there for a long moment looking at the life she had built inside the punishment he had designed, and she watched him understand what it meant. He asked if he could sit. She gestured to the chair. He sat. She sat on the edge of the bed. They talked for 2 hours, not about the estate or the accounts or the letters, about his brother who had died at 17 of a fever and who had been the only person in the East Wing who had ever made Ryan laugh without effort, about her father who had died the same way and left behind 2 daughters and a set of account books and the particular loneliness of a house that has lost its warmth and not yet learned to admit it, about the view from the north corridor window at 7 in the morning, when the grounds were still and the light came in at an angle that made everything look like it was made of something more permanent than it was. When he left, he said goodnight to her, by name, just Chelsea. She said goodnight. His footsteps going back down the corridor were slower than they used to be. Spring came to Aldermere, the way real things come. Not all at once. Not dramatically, in pieces. Snowdrops first, then cold rain, then 3 warm days, then frost again. Then finally, in late March, the grounds committed. The east field came back green. The Morrison barn roof held through its first winter. The south field drainage, cleared and relayed according to the plan Chelsea had proposed and Ryan had approved and they had overseen together through February, ran clean for the first time in 6 years. Chelsea walked the south field on a morning in late March with her boots wet and the thin spring sun on her face, and felt something she identified carefully before she allowed herself to believe it. Not happiness, exactly. Something more durable. The specific satisfaction of a thing built correctly beginning to hold its own weight. She found out she was carrying a child in April. She sat with it for 2 days in the way she sat with difficult things, turning it over, learning its weight, making sure she understood it before she shared it. She thought about Ryan in the estate office in January, saying that was a place to start. She thought about the margin notes, and the 2 hours in the north corridor, and the parlor conversation, and the slow, painful brick-by-brick work of 2 people dismantling the walls they had both built, his of deliberate cruelty and hers of deliberate endurance. She thought about what a child meant inside a marriage that was still becoming itself, still fragile, still new enough that she could feel its edges. On the third day, she told him after dinner, directly, without preamble, the way she had learned he received things best. He went very still. Not the terrible stillness of the midnight study. A different kind. The kind that happens when a man receives something he had stopped allowing himself to expect. He looked at her across the dinner table for a long moment, and then he said he needed a moment. He stood and walked to the window, and stood there with his back to her, and she waited. When he turned around, his face was the open, unarchitectured face she had first seen in the estate office in December. He asked if she was well. She said she was. He asked if she was frightened. She said yes. He said he was too. She said she knew. He said that perhaps being frightened together was different from being frightened alone. She said she thought so. She thought it might be considerably different. A letter arrived from Edinburgh in May, not from Rosalind this time, from Daniel Holt, brief and direct. He wrote that Rosalind had delivered a son in the first week of May, that both were well, that the boy was to be named after Rosalind's father. He wrote one more sentence. He wrote that Rosalind asked him to tell Chelsea that she was glad, that she hoped Chelsea was more than managing, and that she sent her love in the full and genuine sense of the word rather than the obligatory one. Chelsea read this at the writing table in her new rooms, the central corridor rooms with light on both sides, and felt the last of the iron finally, fully release. Not dissolve, not disappear. Release. The way a held breath releases. The way a fist unclenches after holding something too tightly for too long. She wrote back to Daniel Holt, a single paragraph. She said Rosalind's love was received in the full and genuine sense and returned in the same. She said she was glad about the boy. She said she was more than managing. She sealed the letter and sat for a moment in the morning light and thought about a Wiltshire garden on a wet evening and a decision that had felt like arithmetic and had turned out to be something else entirely. Something she did not yet have a precise word for but intended to keep. The child was born in November, a girl, delivered in the central corridor rooms with Mrs. Gale present and the estate physician and Ryan, who had asked to be there and whom Chelsea had allowed because she had decided that allowing was its own kind of power. The labor was long and the November night was dark, and at 2 a.m, when the hardest part was past and the room had gone quiet with the particular quiet of something enormous that has just happened, Ryan took his daughter in his arms for the first time and stood in the candlelight with her, not moving. Chelsea watched him from the bed, tired to her bones and more awake than she had ever been. She watched him look at this child with the face that had run out of architecture, the face she had first seen in December in the estate office and had been watching learn to stay open ever since. He held his daughter for a long time without speaking. Then he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and held the child between them. She was very small. The candle on the bedside table burned low and steady. Outside, November did its November work, gray and certain, the grounds of Aldermere going deep under a sky full of cold stars. Ryan looked up from his daughter's face. He looked at Chelsea. He said he had been thinking about what to call what they had. She said she had been thinking about the same thing. He said he had not found a word for it in English. She said she had not either. He said he thought perhaps it did not require one, that it was the kind of thing that existed before it had a name and would continue existing after the name had worn out. She said she thought that was the most precise thing he had ever said. He almost smiled. The real one. The rare one that took apart every wall it touched. He reached out and placed his free hand over hers where it rested on the blanket. Not a dramatic gesture. Not a declaration. Just his hand on hers with their daughter between them and the candle burning low and the November night outside and the whole long complicated year behind them holding everything they had broken and built and broken and built again. She turned her hand over and held his. That was all. That was everything. In the morning, the grounds would be white with the first frost of the season, and the Southfield drainage would hold, and the Morrison barn roof would hold, and the margin-noted book would still be on the desk in the central corridor. Room and Mrs. Gale would bring chocolate, and the East Wing and the West Wing and all the distances that had been between them would be simply rooms in a house that they both lived in. But that was morning. Right now there was only this: the candle, the child, his hand, hers, the choice, made without fanfare and without a ceremony, simply and finally to stay.